Now, let me welcome Anna Bernard from the University of York in the UK. Dr. Bernard is a lecturer in English, and her PhD is on the Palestinian Israeli literature. Right? The title of the talk is The Traveling Arab Spring.
Thanks very much for that, Loubna. It's a fantastic event, and I'm really pleased to be here. Just to give you some context for where this paper is coming from, I've been working quite a bit over the past couple of years. I'm completing a book which is on Palestinian Israeli literature in world circulation, and I'm particularly interested in the metropolitan reception of the Palestine conflict. This is actually the first time I've tried to think about that in terms of the Arab Spring. This is a very preliminary kind of exploration. But I'm interested in cultures of Palestinian solidarity in the international space. So here I'm thinking about cultures of international solidarity with the Arab Spring. So like Emily, I'm also focusing on American response, but particularly among people who are thinking of themselves as politically active and as part of the left. So, right, to begin, in January of this year, Marketplace Radio, a producer of left-wing programming for American Public Radio, aired an interview segment entitled Where Arab Spring and Occupy Meet. The interviewees were Ahmed Nagib, a participant in the protests at Loubna, and Tammy Shapiro, a member of the Occupy Wall Street movement. The host asked Nagib what he thought of Occupy Wall Street when it first came on the scene last autumn. He responded, quote, "I was thinking good for them, because I believe our generation is all about change. And I don't see what's happening in the States, nor Greece, nor Spain, nor other countries in Europe, and even India, and this Arab Spring is detached. In essence, we're all after the same thing." Shapiro, the Occupy Wall Street protester, was more cautious about claiming parallels between her movement and Nagib's. When asked whether Occupy Wall Street was modeled on the Arab Spring, she replied, quote her a bit at length here, it's important what I want to say. And she did it with a very sort of American suburban kind of intonation, which I may or may not try to imitate here, but it was something like, I think it's not that clear of a direct connection. I think there's a lot of inspiration that we got while we saw movements across the world and even in our own country springing up. But I think that what sparked Occupy Wall Street was the economic system wasn't working for us. So it was both about economic justice and also thinking about how the system itself is broken. Shapiro was friendly but guarded in discussing ways the two movements might work together in the future. The way that we can help each other out is by succeeding as much as possible in our respective movements. There's a lot we can learn from the Egyptian Revolution in terms of the street tactics, in terms of the messaging, in terms of the reaching out to people. And I think that the Occupy movement, we really need to be humble and learn from people who are trying things out all over the world. So I want to start with this moment in this interview, which you can see it's 23 January, it's quite a recent interview that they've chosen for a reason. I think it demonstrates something quite interesting and also important about the way the idea of the Arab Spring has traveled. I talk particularly here about traveling to metropolitan American context. So how this idea has been taken up, adapted, reimagined, and repurposed by observers around the world. We might call this the import-export model of the Arab Spring. When I first listened to this interview to Shapiro saying this, I felt kind of taken aback. It seemed like she was being almost rude by refusing to corroborate that he was offering her in this awkwardly worded but firm demurral at the start. I think it's not that clear of a direct connection. But the more I thought about what she'd said, the more her position made sense to me in the insistence that the idea of the Arab Spring could not travel unchanged, that other protest movements taking up its banner would need to define their aims in relation to their own time and place, not in relation to a global protest movement too big and too various to be conceived of as a single phenomenon. Now, of course, Shapiro's reluctance to describe Occupy Wall Street and the Egyptian Revolution as being after the same thing significantly distances her from the stance taken by much of the American media in the last 6 months. The idea that the Occupy protesters and Egyptian protesters were part of one big world was endorsed by media outlets on the left and on the right, in the margins and in the center of American public discourse. In response to the Day of Rage protests held across the U.S. in 17th September, which of course took their name from protests in Yemen, Bahrain, and Egypt, and before that from the anti-Vietnam protests in the 1960s and 70s. In response to these protests, we get two examples here which I think are quite interesting. On the one hand, I have a left-wing reporter from the American news site Public Record who says, all of this planning by U.S. Day of Rage and the NYC Grassroots Assembly of Occupy Wall Street conjures up memories of Egypt's own Day of Rage and an historic stand at Tahrir Square. And recently, Al Gore called for a Tahrir Square moment in America. He did this on his Twitter feed. The same week, the right-wing American news site Human Events caustically observed, the goal appears to be to bring the Arab Spring and European-style mob action stateside. The term Arab Spring, of course, itself recalls European uprisings, not only 1848, but also the Prague Spring of 1968. And there's a sense here, this may be a characterization, but that by claiming an affiliation with the Arab Spring, European American left is also trying to share some of its glory or even take some of the credit. There have, of course, been a number of objections to the metropolitan use of the term Arab Spring, that it is not the terms that Arabs are using themselves, preferring Thawra or Intifada, Safa, or Nakba. That it implies a defensively Orientalist notion of Arabs waking up from a long slumbering passivity, or that it pessimistically suggests, as in Prague, that after the spring will come the winter. It didn't take long, once the so-called American autumn got going, for commentators to become impatient with the analogy. The Occupy movement has recently been criticized for its dilettantism in comparison with the bravery of the Egyptian protesters, for its ignorance of the real economic and organizational conditions in which the Tahrir uprising took place, and for its quintessentially American sense of self-regard in not wanting to be left out. As one observer put it in a recent article in Foreign Policy, quote, is it the deepest aspects of the Arab Spring or the more superficial ones that have migrated to the West? Before rushing to condemn the metropolitan protesters for cheating the idea of the Arab Spring, however, we do need to acknowledge the sort of dubious assumption which is underlying this kind of criticism, even though it is very convincing. There's an idea here that once an idea migrates, it necessarily becomes degraded. And I think even beyond that, there's an idea that this degradation is happening in the move from the authentically oppressed global south to the spoiled, shallow global north. And so to turn to Edward Said a little bit more here, because I think he gives a more nuanced way of understanding how ideas travel. This is his traveling theory essay, which was published in 1983, in which he notes that although, quote, the movement of ideas and theories from one place to another is both a fact of life and a useful enabling condition of intellectual activity, such movement into a new environment is never unimpeded. It necessarily involves processes of representation and institutionalization different from those at the point of origin. So if we're going to start thinking about the movement of an idea or theory, we have to identify the point of origin, we have to talk about the distance traversed, geographical, historical, ideological, the conditions of its acceptance in a new place, and finally the nature of its transformation. There's little point in condemning the transformation of ideas as such. It is in the very nature of ideas that change from place to place, from past to present, and indeed from thinker to thinker. At the same time, however, Said is impatient with the notion that all such transformations carry equal validity as creative acts of local adaptation and interpretation. He says, it seems to me perfectly possible to judge misreadings as they occur, as part of a historical transfer of ideas and theories from one setting to another. So it's perfectly possible to judge them. We don't have to just say, oh, these are all sort of relative. He then makes an observation that's particularly germane to the criticisms of the traveling Arab Spring. If the theory can move down, so to speak, become a dogmatic reduction of its original version, it can also move up into a sort of bad infinity. A traveling theory risks becoming a theoretical overstatement, a theoretical parody of the situation it was formulated originally to remedy or overcome. So, has the idea of the Arab Spring become a bad infinity or a parody of the original in its migration to the metropole? To answer this question, we first have to be able to distinguish between the different trajectories that the idea of the Arab Spring has taken in metropolitan public discourse. I think the links between micro and noise are important. Again, I'll keep the focus here on the American example, but there's two different trajectories to identify here. On the one hand, we have the response of the American political establishment, both Democrats and Republicans. It's worth remembering that 2011 wasn't the first time the term Arab Spring had been employed in recent years. Arab Spring was also the name that some conservatives gave to see the revolution favoring in 2005. For the neocons, this earlier Arab Spring, as they called it, showed that the American occupation of Iraq had brought democracy and freedom to the Middle East just as they said it would. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama would never say anything quite so crude, but their key speeches on the Arab Spring reveal a similar American self-regard. President Obama, in a key speech in May 2011, damned the Egyptian people with faint praise, declaring that, quote, through the moral force of nonviolence, the people of the region have achieved more change in 6 months than terrorists have accomplished in decades. These are all the same people trying to do the same thing.
I have a question for Anna. You spoke about traveling theory, and I'm wondering if you thought about this, the concept of reverberation that was used by Joe Scott. It's again about traveling theory and how, or ideas or movements, and what happens to them. And what makes me mention this is your point about how when something travels, it's necessarily degraded. And I'm just thinking about this a little bit. I'm thinking, perhaps, would you see in the concept of reverberation, therefore, an opportunity to go away or to avoid this degradation or this sort of judgmental, something that we can judge as opposed to just difference. I mean, difference doesn't have to be good or bad, right? I don't know what you think. I'm wondering what you would say.